Okay, the meeting's now live.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Children, Families and Education Portfolio meeting. I'm Councillor Susie Horton. I'm the Cabinet Member for Children, Families and Education. And this meeting is being held virtually in response to the limitations placed on governance by the COVID-19 pandemic. The City Solicitor has advised that this meeting will be run by reference to the model standing orders as set out in the Local Authorities Coronavirus Flexibility of Local Authority Meetings Regulations 2020 number 392. Members of the public are invited to view this meeting, and there has been the opportunity for written representations to be submitted. Those present are requested to keep their microphones on mute and to only turn them on when they're called to speak. Members are requested to keep their cameras turned on at all times, please. And officers are requested to turn their cameras on only when they are presenting their reports or answering questions. If anyone would like to speak, please write your name and RTS, which is request to speak, in the chat function. I think we're all used to that now. And if there are any technical difficulties, we will endeavour to resolve these and, where necessary, have a brief adjournment. I will ask the opposition spokespeople to introduce themselves, followed by the officers attending today's meeting. So I'll first of all come to Councillor Norton.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. Councillor Terry Norton, Conservative spokesperson. Good
afternoon and welcome. Councillor Smith.
Councillor Jeanette Smith, Independent Group.
Thank you, Councillor Smith, and welcome. And I can't see Councillor Smythe on here. Lisa, am I missing something, or is she not on here at the moment?
I don't think she's joined us currently.
Okay, all right then. So if she does, we'll ask her to introduce herself. And to go around the officers, Alison Edgerton first, please.
Hello, Alison Edgerton, Group Accountant for Children, Families and Education Finance.
Welcome. Angela Mann.
Hi, I'm Angela Mann. I'm Finance Manager for Children, Families and Education.
Thank you and welcome. Julia Catherine.
Hello, Julia Catherine, Head of Inclusion within Education.
Thank you and welcome. It says Mike Stoneman here, but I understand I'll deal with that in apologies, actually, because he can't come today. Sarah Daly is here. I've seen her, I think. Oh, did she come and go?
I think she came and went, Councillor.
Okay, all right then. So if I see her again, I'll welcome her to the meeting. Alison Jeffrey.
Hello. Oops. Sorry, trying to get my camera to come off. Hello, Alison Jeffrey, Director of Children, Families and Education for the City Council.
Thank you. Lisa Gallagher.
Hello, Lisa Gallagher, President from Democratic Services.
Welcome. And last but not least on my list, Jonathan Waite.
Yeah, Jonathan Waite, Democratic Services.
All welcome. Thank you. So the first agenda item is apologies for absence, and as I hinted, Mike Stoneman has sent his today. Are there any others, Lisa?
No, we've not received any other apologies.
Okay, thank you. And so then the second item is declarations of interest. This is for members. I will kick off with the fact that I am Vice Chair of Governors at Craneswater Junior School, and I see that Councillor Smith has asked to speak. So Councillor Smith.
Yeah, my declaration of interest is I'm a paid official of Unison, which obviously has members in schools. If there is an item that mentions trade unions or HR, then I'll probably have to withdraw, but I don't think there's anything on the agenda at the moment.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Norton.
Yeah, thank you. The same one, usual one from me. I am employed at Mayfield School, albeit through an external company.
Thank you very much. Okay, with no further ado then, we will move on to item 3, which is school funding arrangements 21-22, and I believe...
Sorry, so Judith has joined us. Sorry.
I haven't seen... Oh, yes, I can see now. Councillor Smythe.
I have no interest.
I have no pecuniary
Yeah.
other interest.
That's brilliant. Well, welcome to the meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So item 3, Angela, are you presenting this report?
I am, thank you.
Over to you.
So the report follows from the previous report that outlined the approach set in the school budget, and primary and secondary schools will be funded using the national funding formula for 2021-22. The values published by the DfE have been increased in line with the Portsmouth area cost adjustment in our formula. The minimum per pupil funding levels have been used as is shown in table 3, and because of this 10 schools received additional funding through this mechanism. In addition to that, a minimum funding guarantee has been applied of 2% compared to the 2021 funding. National non-domestic rate values have been amended to reflect the latest changes. And the lump sum minimum for the national funding formula is 119,000, but due to additional one-off funding we've received, this has been able to be increased to £132,998. And the growth fund is detailed in 5.16 to 5.19 and shows that there will be sufficient funding for the next 5 years. The criteria is included in Appendix 3 and is for endorsement after this was approved by Schools Forum yesterday. In terms of the Central Schools block, we saw an increase of 3.8% per pupil, plus the teachers' pay and pension grants. The increase in the budget is to pay for additional licensing costs and duties which were retained on behalf of schools, and also we've used it to increase slightly the support to support the delivery of Schools Forum. And for early years, the details came to the decision day previously, but since then we've had an education rate increase per hour for both the 3 and 4 year olds and the 2 year olds. And it is proposed to increase the hourly rates by the same amounts as detailed in 7.2. The high needs budgets are still being worked on, and originally you'll see in the recommendation that we were asking for approval of the banded funding values for 2021-22 for mainstream schools, inclusion centres and alternative provision special schools as set out in Appendix 4. But Schools Forum has asked for a deferment, so the February report covering this will also cover the recommendation now. But due to the timings, we weren't able to change this for the report. And I was just any other questions in relation to the report. Oh, sorry, Susie, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think your internet was breaking up a little bit for me at some parts, but I think I got the gist of it, and I think the key points are the change or the additional information around early years funding, which I think is a real positive one. The other thing was around the element 3 top-ups, which I think Councillor Smythe and Councillor Norton were at Schools Forum last night, so they'd be pretty versed on it. But for Councillor Smith's benefit, there was some discussion around those band values, and it's going to be revisited at the next Schools Forum. Does anyone else have any questions for Angela? I think it's quite straightforward. Councillor Norton.
Yeah, I do have some questions actually, and they're probably quite broad ones, if that's okay, Susie. So looking through the report here, I'm looking at point 8.2, where there's discussion about high needs, and it mentions that the discussions are in progress. Is there anything in place to alleviate the pressure that I think is going to come from social services? I mean, at the moment, we've got lots of children off school. Obviously, when we come back, we know that when children are off school, there's a strain on social services. We've seen what the figures have done, over the summer. But when children return to school, there's going to be an obvious strain on those services. Is there anything in place? And as those discussions are taking place, is there anything we can do to ensure that there are resources and funding available for the issues that we're bound to incur when children return to school. I hope that makes sense. Does it?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. I think it kind of was touched upon a little bit, maybe not immediate funding, but last night, which was the answer that Julia gave around this, what do we anticipate to be the consequences in a way of the pandemic? And of course, we can't predict those exactly, but what we've done at the moment is to put a lot in place at the moment. And I guess it's a movable feast the whole time, isn't it? We're not exactly entirely sure, but I think you're absolutely right to raise the issue of it's more likely that there will be an increased need from going through a pandemic than not. I see Alison Jeffrey's got her hand up. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, just to say that we keep an eye on the resources available that we need to respond to children who fall into the children in need category, needing a statutory social care intervention, and also those who we need to provide early help to on a targeted basis. We keep that under review on a week-by-week basis to make sure that we are, we have sufficient resources to meet that need. And we've put extra staff in the MASH through the pandemic because of the additional response, the additional demand that's there. So we will be doing that in response to that demand. There won't be a rationing of social care and early help support. Obviously, that comes from a different part of the budget landscape, not from the Direct Schools grant, but from the council's cash limit.
Thank you. There's no other comments. Has anyone else got any other questions specifically on this budget paper? No.
Sorry, Susie,
Oh,
if
sorry.
I can come back.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah,
I
no.
do apologise. Just to come back on that. So on that, it does say in 9.1 about the carryover. So I appreciate that it's potentially from a different budget. Is there anything that we could do? If there's 4.1 million being carried over, is there any way that those funds can be put aside or somehow ring-fenced or protected so that we don't get an issue with lack of immediacy if children do come back to school en masse and there are loads of social services issues being picked up and lots of attention that needs to go into dealing with these children? We know that the lockdown disproportionately affects children from poorer backgrounds and potentially those in high need. I would hate to think that schools are suddenly swamped under with something that we anticipated could happen and struggle to access funding when we've got a £4.1 million carryover. Is there any way that we can make sure that those funds and those services will be accessible with immediacy?
I hear what you're saying, Councillor Norton. The issue is that the money and the Direct Schools grant can only be spent in certain ways, so it wouldn't be open to us to refocus it on children's social care. I think I would like to reassure you that we don't anticipate we'll be in a position where we just cannot meet the need for children's social care support. We're in quite regular and frequent discussion with finance colleagues about that. It may be that Angela can come in and talk to you about what will happen to monies in the DSG that can't be spent, because we used to have a carry forward and we had a reserve for a long time, and then we exhausted that. But Angela, do you want to say some more?
Thank you. Yeah, it's just to say that there are plans for using the balances. So a big commitment will be the new special school that's due to open in September 22 because of the lag that we have in terms of our funding. The funding catches up the following year, so we have plans already to use some of that, and some of the carry forward will also be for the growth fund that's mentioned, because we don't need it all this year, but we will need some of it for the coming 5 years. So there are plans for the use of that as per the regulations for the dedicated schools grant.
Is that it? Are we okay now, Councillor Norton?
I'm afraid there is one more thing from me. I do
Okay.
apologise. And it's just moving forward. I may have skipped ahead a little bit too much, but it was notes that I made earlier, and it moves on to the decision-making process, which is on page 32. And it speaks about, forgive me if I've jumped ahead here, but it talks about the school's contingency fund and potential for head teachers to apply for, schools to apply for additional funding. I guess the question for me, and please do correct me if you think that it just doesn't happen, but I do feel that there's sometimes a negative stigma around head teachers asking for additional funding. I think they see it as a reflection on themselves and therefore may not come and say, look, can we have extra money for whatever? We often hear stories about, schools not being able to afford toilet rolls and things, and yet there always seems to be reserves that haven't been dipped into. So I guess if I'm wrong, please correct me, but are we doing everything we can to make sure that if schools do feel they can apply for additional funding and contingency funds, they can do that without prejudice and any kind of reflection on themselves? I don't want schools to suffer in silence, I guess, is what I'm saying. If you don't feel that that is something that happens and I've misjudged that, then please do say. But we see lots of, like I said, I see lots of stories where, government are blamed for the schools that can't afford books and toilet rolls, and my understanding is that there are contingency pots like this and reserves, but happy to be corrected.
Angela, is your hand up to respond to this, or is that a legacy hand?
Oh, sorry, it was a legacy hand,
okay.
but I think Alison might be able to answer that one.
Alison, if you come in, I think from my perspective, it's around the rules and regulations around budgets. I don't think we're at will to be able to just hand out where we think, in our opinion, it might be worthwhile. But I'm sure Alison can clarify that.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the school-specific contingency fund is only available to maintain primary and secondary schools, and this is because the fund is actually made up from a de-delegated amount that maintained schools contributed to this pot of funding. The guidance relating to how schools can access it is circulated to all schools at the beginning of every financial year. We haven't had any school come and actually apply for use of the pot of money in the past, but if schools do feel that they meet the criteria that's actually in there, then they're perfectly happy to come and talk to us, set up a business case, and it will come back to Schools Forum for any decision.
Thank you for that. Is that it now, Councillor Norton? Thank you. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the discussion of that item. So the decisions, I will go through them because one of them now has changed. So to approve the proposed changes to the mainstream schools revenue funding arrangements as set out in section 6, approve the school revenue funding pro forma appendix 5 for submission to the ESFA on the 21st of January. Approve the budget to be held centrally for the payment of central licences, as was mentioned, negotiated nationally for all schools by the Secretary of State. Then number 4, which was approving the element 3 top-up, we will now defer. The next one is to following the funding announcement, from the DFE, approve the proposed hourly rates to the early years providers for 21-22 as set out in section 7 and table 5. And following the approval by Schools Forum, it's recommended that the growth fund criteria for 21-22 is endorsed as set out in appendix 3. And the budgets to be held centrally, specifically Schools Forum admissions and duties retained by the local authority for all schools. Okay. Right, so item 4 is the Inclusion Centre funding arrangement.
Susie, did you mean, you said under recommendation number 1, section 6, did you mean section 5?
I did mean section 5, thank you. Thanks for correcting that. That's a very important point when you actually look at the sections. You're right. Item 4, Inclusion Centre funding arrangements 21-22, and I believe that Julia Catherine is going to present this report. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Yes. So this is recommending that Cabinet member agrees to implementing a banded funding model for mainstream schools with an inclusion centre. And introduction of a banded funding model would be in line with the way that we already fund special schools in the city, and also in line with the way that we will be funding children with education, health and care plans in mainstream schools in the city from April. The idea of the banded funding model is that funding is determined based on the statutory assessment of the child's needs, and the band of funding is allocated according to a set of published criteria, and so therefore a child with more complex needs would be subject to a higher band of funding in recognition of the increased provision that would need to be put in place for that child. So the paper sets out the 9, in section 3, the 9 mainstream schools in the city that already have inclusion centres, and table 1 includes the current funding arrangements for those inclusion centres. So the way that they're funded at the moment is that the top-up value, so the additional value for each filled space, is the same for any child attending that particular provision, that particular inclusion centre. And the rates you'll see are slightly different for the different inclusion centres. Section 4 sets out the reasons why we want to move to this banded funding model. So it's because there's a perceived inequity between the funding levels for each school. They're based on historical funding arrangements rather than being a needs-led model, which is what we want to move to, where the funding is based on the needs of the child. Having one band per school means that if we wanted to place a child with more complex needs, then they would be funded at the same level with a child with less complex needs at that school. And if a child moves, so for example, children move from Milton Park Primary School up to Trafalgar Secondary School with the same types of needs, the funding levels for those two schools are very different. So again, it's not needs-led. So we want to move to a banded funding level in line with the way that we fund children with education, health and care plans in other schools in the city. And table 2 in section 4 sets out the bands of funding that we're proposing. So there'll be some children who there isn't a need for any additional funding. Their needs can be met with what's ordinarily available. There would be a core band of funding, an enhanced band, an exceptional band, and a highly exceptional. And that's the same language that we already use in our special schools and that we are moving to with our mainstream schools as well. We have done some modelling to look at the impact on schools. So you'll see from the table at the end of table 3 in section 4.6. Now this is indicative funding. This is not based on the actual pupils, because obviously that would be subject to assessment. We need to look at the banding criteria for the actual pupils. But this is just looking at if we suppose that 70% of the pupils were on core, 15% on enhanced, 10% on exceptional, and 5% on highly exceptional. That's roughly what the funding would work out as. You'll see there that the only school that's negatively impacted is Milton Park Primary, which obviously is a concern. But I would just reiterate that this is not based on actual children. So if, for example, all of the children at Milton Park currently had more complex needs, then obviously those figures would need to be adjusted. And as I said before, that is one of the issues that we're wanting to address in terms of the inequity with the current arrangements, in that Devonshire, Milton Park, Portsdown Primary and Southsea Infant School, they all have the same admission criteria, so potentially are taking the same children but are funded at different levels. We have worked really closely with all of the schools with an inclusion centre in developing these proposals. We actually started that piece of work in 2019 with a working group, and there was a very strong view from all of the schools that we need to move to a more equitable model. We engaged with schools again in December to just revisit that and check that that was still the direction of travel that schools were in support of. And you'll see the questions that came up as part of that engagement exercise in table 4, which we responded. So the band of funding can be changed if it's no longer appropriate through the annual review process, and that's the same for all children. That's part of the statutory process. The number of commissioned places is confirmed in January for the following September, which gives all schools then sufficient time to plan the staffing that they need. And the SEN team can provide advice on the actual children who are currently placed and who are likely to be placed in September, so we can look at the actual impact on the budget. I will stop there and happy to take any questions. Oh, I'm sorry, you were on mute, Councillor Horton.
I'm so sorry. I'm not doing very well with my mute button today, am I? I think all 3 councillors want to either ask things or make statements. So I'll come to Councillor Smith first.
Yeah, thank you. What I'm about to say is all my fault because I found this report really confusing. I didn't quite understand how the figures were got, and I've sort of got it now through your explanation, but the questions I have, if it's children needs led, who makes that decision and how are the bandings fitting that criteria?
Yes, so the decision is made as part of the statutory assessment process, and that happens already. So at the moment, a level of funding will be attached to an EHCP, or a placement will be agreed for an inclusion centre as part of that statutory assessment process. The change here is that we will be allocating a band of funding depending on the child's needs, and the banding criteria are attached as an appendix as by way of an example. So basically there's a description of, for the core band, that would include this range of needs and this range of provision we would expect to be able to be provided from that funding band. So the child's needs would be matched to a banding criteria, and then the funding band attached on that basis.
Okay, just a follow up if I may. So Milton Park, I'm really worried about Milton Park. I was a governor there for many years. To have a cut of £79,000 is quite substantial. So how are we going to mitigate that? Because that would be impossible for school to take that amount of drop all at once.
Yeah, so I mean, finance colleagues may want to step in here as well, but that figure is not based on actual children currently placed. That is an indicative figure based on the assumptions made in the modelling. So if the majority of the children at Milton Park were on the core banding, then there would be less funding received. They would also be required to put in a level of provision. So the funding obviously needs to match the provision that we're asking the school to put in. And if the children currently placed are at a higher, on a higher band of funding, so have more complex needs, then obviously the reduction in funding would be much reduced from that level. And you need to look at individual children's needs, I think, to determine the exact amount that would be the impact of that.
Are you okay, Councillor Smith, with that?
Okay, but I'll let other people come.
I could see it, you processing it. But, yeah, I could see that. Okay, well maybe some of the other questions may help that. Okay, thank you. So I think it was at I'll go on the list of the RTS. So it's Councillor Norton next. I think you both came in at the same time, but
yeah, thank you. No, my question probably won't clear any of that up, but like Councillor Smith, I apologise because this is probably something that I could have found out prior to the meeting. So home to school transport isn't affected, it's a completely different budget. So from those lists, from those there, none of that funding, there are no contributions into home school transport or anything like that. That's right, isn't it?
That's
okay,
correct.
So probably a question for a future meeting or somewhere outside of this, just to clear up what, because of savings from homeschool transport, what's happening with that funding, but I guess that's something to be said offline. So forget that. Thank you for answering that, and apologies I didn't find that out prior.
Okay, thank you. So, Councillor Judith Smythe.
Well, I had the advantage of being at the schools forum yesterday, and I asked a similar question, but I think I would like to ask it again because this is a different place and there'll be a different audience for the minutes and so forth. I mean, the amount of money that the Milton Park School gets at the moment is at £122,500 is enough for 15 children at the highly exceptional band of 8,000. So it is really very, very much out of line. And I think it would be interesting to know, perhaps out of, offline, what impact that will actually have on, because I mean, it's bound to be less. It's going to be less than that by 8,000 anyway. Which are quite big sums to start losing, actually. And I think I would want to see some form of a slide going, perhaps between 2 years or something, to mitigate, because it's 2 full-time teachers, if plus all the on costs, as it's a serious amount of money. I do appreciate that the figures in the second column could go up or down, but nevertheless, whatever you do to that one, it's a lot of money to lose. I mean, I'm rather surprised that we let it run so long like that. That was my other comment, because it is way more than anybody else. And I wondered whether that was because they do have some genuinely exceptionally needy children there, or still have, and whether there was something that needs to be done there.
Yeah, I'm really happy to answer that. So originally, the admission criteria for the Milton Park provision were different to the admission criteria to the other inclusion centres, and children at Milton Park had autism, and so had a higher complexity of need. And as over the years, as we've seen the numbers of children with autism increase, there were more children with autism who needed that level of support than we could place at Milton Park. So it was always full and more than full, and with a waiting list. So therefore, we did a piece of work with a number of the inclusion centres. So we now have 6 inclusion centres, all with the same admission criteria, so all able to meet the needs of of children with the same types of needs. And we've obviously done work with those schools to skill up staff, to provide training, to develop that provision with them, and they work together. And what that means is that we can place more children with autism and a high level of need, and also we can keep more children in a local school, which does have an impact on the home to school transport budget, which Councillor Norton mentioned, even though that is a separate budget. But it means that children can be in their local community as much as possible, which is what we want. So that change has happened also over the last couple of years. And so the last bit now is to address the funding anomaly, which, as you say, means that at the moment we've got children who in year 6 are at Milton Park School with a certain level of funding, and then from the July to the September move to Trafalgar, the same child, same level of needs, same requirement for provision, but obviously a much different level of funding. So we wanted to address that inequity in the system.
I mean, just to follow up, we're opening another special school for children with autism. We know we've got a lot of autistic children in Cliffdale. Indeed, when I was chair of governors there, very aware of the increasing needs of children at Cliffdale. So is it reasonable to assume that these units in these mainstream schools will be, for a while, not quite so burdened with the highest need children, or have we just got such a huge need that they will be filled up with, as I suspect, filled up with children who have got autism and behavioural difficulties and all sorts of challenges?
Yeah, so our biggest increase is children with autism. And yes, so our new special school, which will be opening in September 2022, will be for children with autism and associated social, emotional and mental health and behavioural issues. But that's the biggest growth that we're seeing. And obviously, we want to be able to keep children in the city, because if we can't make this specialist provision in the city, we're then forced to look at out of city placements, which is not in the best interest of children, keeping them in their families, keeping them local, and making sure that they have those same opportunities as any other child. So it is a reflection of that increase in the number of children with the most complex needs that we're seeing.
Very lastly, when I was working in children's services and education and looking at the sort of high-end needs of children, there were some places where particularly some autistic children with very, very high needs and very difficult, challenging behaviour were moving around from unit to unit. And that was also detrimental to them because they need the stability and their parents need the stability. And indeed, their parents were moving them around in a way that was not in the child's best interest. Is that possible to happen here in Portsmouth or not?
That's not something that we see in Portsmouth. Obviously, placement of any child with an education, health and care plan is made by the City Council. And it's based on assessment. So the more thorough the assessment and the better the continuum of provision available, if we can make the right decisions about the child's needs and the placement, hopefully they won't then need to move. And so, making sure that we've got that right continuum between primary and secondary, for example, means that hopefully we can place the child at one of Milton Park, for example, and they can move through the school and then move on to an inclusion centre at Trafalgar Secondary if that remains the right provision for them, and they don't need to be chopping and changing and moving from school to school.
So you were saying that doesn't happen much here. I was quite appalled by that. We're now talking some years back, but one or two places where we found that was happening through some research we did in connection with the national programme, we were absolutely shocked. And some parents, there's no doubt about it, were trying to find the right one and moving children quite huge distances and are not in their interest, I don't think. But you're saying that doesn't happen here. That's great. Thank you.
We don't have that issue here, and we also, we're really pleased that we have very low numbers of children out of city for their education, which is a real positive as well. Much lower than some other areas. So really pleased about that.
Yes, no, congratulations on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Smith has got a follow-up, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I just feel I need to come in and sort of defend Milton Park a little bit because I was there when the centre was sort of set up, and it was seen in its first year as a centre of excellence. So they provided some fantastic care there. And my worry is, listening to the debate on this, is that we're levelling down rather than levelling up. And I'm sorry to use a government word there, but it just feels that Milton Park are now paying the price for excellence. And that's not how it should be. It should be everybody coming up to Milton Park's level, because they're dealing with complex needs. And they have done since it was open. So the 122,000 was because it was complex needs. But now, because of the change in funding, I think the needs are exactly the same, but they get less money for it. That, to me, is dumbing it down.
Yeah, I mean, it would be lovely to be able to fund every school at 8,000. It would be lovely to be able to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's an option at the moment. It would mean that we would have fewer places overall. But the other thing to say that I think is really important is that the funding is matched to banding criteria, and the banding criteria sets out what the range of needs are, and also describes the provision. So it describes, for example, the adult to child ratio that's needed for those children. So we're not asking schools to deliver £8,000 worth of provision, but only be funded for £2,000. What we're saying is, if the child needs the £8,000 worth, we will recognise that and put them at that band. But there are some children who don't need that level. And all this is saying is that those children could be in a number of different schools now. They're not all concentrated within the one school. So it's not a reflection of, poor practice anywhere. We have all of our inclusion centres, I would say, are now centres of excellence. It's just saying that we want to keep children as local as possible, and they could therefore be in any of those inclusion centres.
In my utopian world, they should be on the 8,000 because they have a complex need anyway. I know that's my utopian world. I'm sorry about that.
No, and I think you raise a really good point, because I think the logic of it is exactly that. And if we had more funding, from nationally, I think everyone would be able to shift their perceptions about what is £8,000 worth. But we're dealing with a limited pot of money, and I, I speak to a lot of people, my counterparts around the country, and actually we do amazingly well, and whilst maintaining those high standards. But I have to agree with you. I think it is a case of expectation management, possibly, rather than a comment on the actual, rather than any comment on any particular setting or the quality of what's actually given, and we've all had to adjust to that. Judith, is yours a legacy hand or another? It's a legacy. Okay, that was a really, really interesting discussions. And one of the other questions which was raised last night at the Schools Forum. Oh, sorry, I will come back to you, Terry. I'll just say it before it leaves my head. Which I thought, which really left me pondering last night, is, with a projected decline in the child population, what will that look like in the special needs world when we have seen year on year rising numbers? So there's a kind of very simplistic logic that if the school population declines, then therefore obviously special educational needs demands will decline. But of course it's far more complex than that. So I think there'll be some interesting years to come, let's put it that way.
There is, of course, a bulge of children going through from primary school to secondary school.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if we're going to have problems with people not being offered, well, not a large enough percentage of people being offered their first choice, particularly in South Sea. A number of parents have raised that with me. They've probably raised it with you as well, Susie.
No, actually they haven't. But are you talking about special educational needs or just secondary school places? Yeah. No, I haven't actually so far. Maybe this will trigger it. I'll come back to Councillor Norton. I think you wanted to come back, yeah?
Yep, thank you. No, I just wanted to shadow Councillor Smythe's comments, actually. I was trying to look through the report I'm sure there was something in there about parental preference, and I just wanted to shadow it's hugely frustrating. I've worked at PRUs and inclusion centres and things, and relationships are built only for a student then to be whisked off on parental preference. And there is something in there, I think, about parental preference. So I guess it would be helpful to know what extent PCC consider parental preference in their decision making, and if there's anything we can do around that to really encourage consistency for settling at some of these places. I think Councillor Smythe's already made the comments, but I remember seeing something in there about PCC considering parental preference in their decisions.
Yes. So as part of the education, health and care assessment process and finalising that EHCP and securing placement, parents are always invited to express a preference. And written into the legislation and into the code of practice is a presumption of inclusion, which is that if the parents want their child to be educated in a mainstream school, then there are only two very specific reasons why we as the local authority can't go along with that request. So there's a very heavy weight given to inclusion. So yes, that's parental preference is always taken into consideration, and we always have to go with parental preference unless those two very specific criteria are met. So if the type of school is inappropriate for the child's needs, so say that their needs are, say that the parental preference is for a school for learning needs, and the child is more able and therefore wouldn't have a peer group, that would be inappropriate for them. They, or all the children were non-verbal and they were the only child with verbal abilities, that sort of thing. So that's one circumstance. The only other circumstance is if it would be an inappropriate use of resources. So if you would have to create such a specialist provision in a mainstream school, for example, that it would cost you, way over and out of proportion, and it was then taking resources away from the other children in the school in order to cater for that one child. In all other cases, we always have to go with parental preference. And so it's really important that parents are given the right information so that they can make an informed preference. And so we use vehicles like the local offer website to make sure we're informing parents about the provision that we've got in the city. And so, for example, in terms of the inclusion centres, we work really hard in partnership with parents and with the schools to make sure that parents are kind of expressing those preferences with all of the information they need in order to do that, because we want to make sure it's as you say, we want to make sure we're getting the placement right so that children are not then moving around when they don't need to.
That was a very interesting answer, and a reminder of the code of practice for me, that's for sure. Actually, a nice segue in with the promotion of the local offer as well, Julia. So probably this is just a request for people. If it's definitely something that doesn't say on the tin what's inside, but we have to use that language because that is what it has to be called. So if there's any opportunities that you members and anyone else has for promoting what it actually is, it would be much appreciated. We've done a little bit of comms on it recently because people say, I don't know what it is. And it's so crucial to anybody who's got any questions about special educational needs. So yes, good plug, Julia. I like that. Okay, so I do
Susie,
think.
could you resend that out? Sorry, could you resend that comms out to us? Is that okay? So we can.
Yeah, we will do that. Thank you. So that brings us to the end of that discussion, which is very interesting. And the recommendation is that I agree to the implementation of the proposal to move arrangements for mainstream schools with an inclusion centre as set out in the report, which I am happy to do. And which brings us on to the final item, item 5, which is the Wimborne amalgamation balances. And it's back to Alison, I believe, or to Alison, to present this quite straightforward report, I think.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, so following the amalgamation of Wimborne Infant and Wimborne Junior Schools to form Wimborne Primary School, the School and Early Years, the School and Early Years Finance England regulations require the authority to close the accounts of the infant and junior schools and to put the resulting balances back into the dedicated schools grant. Then we're able to then pay the balance to the primary school. The report sets out the impact of the transfer of the balances on the school's specific contingency fund in 2021 and proposes that the balance of 141,800 is restored to the same fund in 21-22. The Maintain School members endorsed the proposal at Schools Forum on the 13th of January, and the recommendation is for the Cabinet member to approve the payment, the closing balances of Wimborne Infant and Junior Schools to the primary school and to reinstate the school specific contingency in 21-22. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I think it's quite straightforward. You get off easily, Alison.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. In which case, I recommend that it's approved that the transfer of the infant and junior schools closing balances to Wimborne Primary School from the school specific contingency and approve the use of the 2021 carry forward in 21-22 to reinstate the school specific contingency to the balance of 141,800 as at December 2020. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's meeting. Thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you officers for the reports and for answering the questions so fully, and thank you to members for posing the questions, and hopefully we've explored these things with the respect that they are needed. So I'm happy to close the meeting.
Okay, I'll just go and stop the live stream.
Thank you, Lisa.